Chapter 4. After leaving Fusako on her way to work, Ryuji returned briefly to the Rakuyo, and then taxied back through empty, simmering streets to the park where they had stopped the night before. He couldn't think of anywhere else to go until late afternoon, when they had arranged to meet. It was noon and the park was empty. The drinking fountain was overflowing, dyeing the stone walk a watery black. Locusts were shrilling in the cypress trees. The harbor, sprawling toward the sea from the foot of the hill, rumbled thickly. But Ryuji painted out the noontime scene with reminiscences of night. He relived the evening, paused to savor a moment, traced and traced again the night's course. Not bothering to wipe the sweat from his face, he picked absently at a piece of cigarette paper that clung to his lip, while again and again his mind moaned, "How could I have talked so goddamn badly?" He hadn't been able to explain his ideas of glory and death, or the longing and the melancholy pent up in his chest, or the other dark passions choking in the ocean's swell. Whenever he tried to talk about those things, he failed. If there were times when he felt he was worthless, there were others when something like the magnificence of the sunset over Manila Bay sent its radiant fire through him, and he knew that he had been chosen to tower above other men. But he hadn't been able to tell the woman his conviction. He remembered her asking, "Why haven't you ever married?" And he remembered his simpering answer, "It's not easy to find a woman who is willing to be a sailor's wife." What he had wanted to say was, "All the other officers have 2 or 3 children by now, and they read letters from home over and over again, and look at pictures their kids have drawn of houses and the sun and flowers. Those men have thrown opportunity away. There's no hope for them anymore. I've never done much, but I've lived my whole life thinking of myself as the only real man. And if I'm right, then a limpid, lonely horn is going to trumpet through the dawn someday. And a turgid cloud laced with light will sweep down, and the poignant voice of glory will call for me from the distance, and I'll have to jump out of bed and set out alone. That's why I've never married. I've waited and waited, and here I am past 30. But he hadn't said anything like that, partly because he doubted a woman would understand. Nor had he mentioned his concept of ideal love. A man encounters the perfect woman only once in a lifetime, and, in every case, death interposes, an unseen Pandarus, and lures them into the preordained embrace. This fantasy was probably a product of the hyperbole of popular songs, but over the years it had taken on substance in some recess of his mind, and merged there with other things. The shrieking of a tidal wave, the ineluctable force of high tide, the avalanching break of surf upon a shoal. And he had been certain that the woman before him was the woman in the dream. If only he had found the words to say it. In the grand dream Ryuji had treasured secretly for so long, he was a paragon of manliness, and she the consummate woman. And from the opposite corners of the earth, they came together in a chance encounter, and death wed them. Outdistancing tawdry farewells then, with streamers waving in strains of Auld Lang Syne, and far from sailors' fickle loves, they were to descend to the bottom of the heart's great deep, where no man has ever been. But he hadn't been able to share even a fragment of his mad dream. Instead, he had talked of greens. Every once in a while, when you're on a long cruise and you pass the galley, you catch just a glimpse of radish, or maybe turnip leaves. And you know, those little splashes of green make you tingle all over. You feel like getting down on your knees and worshiping them. I can imagine, I think I know just how you must feel. Fusako agreed eagerly. Her voice oozed the joy a woman takes in consoling a man. Ryuji asked for her fan and shooed the mosquitoes away. Lamps on distant masts twinkled like ochre stars. Bulbs in the eaves of the warehouses directly below stretched in regular bright rows. He wanted to talk about the strange passion that catches hold of a man by the scruff of his neck and transports him to a realm beyond the fear of death. But far from finding words for that, he volunteered an account of the hardships he had known and clucked his tongue. His father, a civil servant, had raised him and his sister single-handed after their mother's death. The sickly old man had worked overtime in order to send Ryuji to school. Despite everything, Ryuji had grown up into a strong, healthy man. Late in the war, his home had been destroyed in an air raid, and his sister had died of typhus shortly after. He had graduated from the Merchant Marine High School and was just starting on his career when his father died too. His only memories of life on shore were of poverty and sickness and death, of endless devastation. By becoming a sailor, he had detached himself from the land forever. It was the first time he had talked of these things at such length to a woman. Exultation swelled Ryuji's voice when he touched on the misery in his life, and while he was recalling the total in his bank book, he couldn't help digressing from the sea's power and benevolence, which was the story he had longed to tell, in order to boast about his own prowess like a very ordinary man indeed. It was just another particular aspect of his vanity. He wanted to talk about the sea. He might have said something like this. It was the sea that made me begin thinking secretly about love more than anything else. You know, a love worth dying for, or a love that consumes you. To a man locked up in a steel ship all the time, the sea is too much like a woman. Things like her lulls and storms, or her caprice, or the beauty of her breast reflecting the setting sun, are all obvious. More than that, you're in a ship that mounts the sea and rides her, and yet is constantly denied her. It's the old saw about miles and miles of lovely water, and you can't quench your thirst. Nature surrounds a sailor with all these elements so like a woman, and yet he is kept as far as a man can be from her warm, living body. That's where the problem begins, right there, I'm sure of it. But he could only mouth a few lines of his song. Now the sea's my home, I decided that. But even I must shed a tear. I guess that's pretty funny. It's my favorite song. I think it's a wonderful song, she said. But she was only shielding his pride, he knew. Obviously, this was the first time she had ever heard the song, though she pretended to know it well. She can't penetrate to the feelings deep down in a song like this, or see through the murk of my manhood, to the longing that sometimes makes me weep. Fair enough? Then, as far as I'm concerned, she's just another body. He saw at a glance how delicate and how fragrant a body it was. Fusako was wearing a black lace kimono over a crimson underrobe, and her obi was white brocade. Her milky face floated coolly in the dusk. Crimson peeped seductively through the black lace. She was a presence suffusing the air around them with the softness of being a woman. An extravagant, elegant woman. Ryuji had never seen anything like her. The robe shifted fantastically from crimson through shades of purple as every subtle movement of her body altered the play of light from the distant lamps. And he detected within the shadowed folds of cloth the hushed breathing of the woman's own folds. Her sweat and perfume fragrance reaching him on the breeze seemed to clamor for his death. Die, 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 it screamed. And he imagined the time when her delicate fingertips, stealthy now and reluctant, would quicken into tongues of flame. Her nose was perfect, her lips exquisite. Like a master ringing a go stone onto the board after long deliberation, he placed the details of her beauty, one by one in the misty dark, and drew back to savor them. Her eyes were quiet and icy, and their chill was lewdness itself, indifference to the world become reckless lechery. Her eyes had haunted Ryuji, since they had agreed to meet for dinner the day before. They had kept him awake all night. And what voluptuous shoulders. Like the shoreline, they began with no real beginning, to slope gently downward from the cape of her neck, gracious, dignified shoulders fashioned so that silk might slip and fall away. When I hold her breasts, they'll nestle against my palms with a marvelous, sweaty heaviness. I feel responsible for all this woman's flesh, because it teases me softly like other things that are mine. I'm trembling with the sweetness of her being here, and when she feels me tremble, she'll tilt up like a leaf in a wind-tossed tree and show the white backs of those eyes of hers. An odd, silly story thrust abruptly into Ryuji's mind. Once the captain had told him about going to Venice and visiting a beautiful little palace at high tide, and being astounded to find, when he got there, that the marble floors were underwater. Ryuji almost spoke the words aloud. Small, beautiful, flooded palace. "Please talk some more," Fusako begged, and he knew it would be all right to kiss her. The smooth, inflamed play of their lips altered subtly, with every contact and clinging release, as from angle after angle they poured each other full of light, spinning into a single luminous thread, all of softness and of sweetness. The shoulders under his rough hands now were more real than any dream. Like an insect folding in its wings, Fusako lowered her long lashes. Happiness enough to drive a man crazy, Ryuji thought. Happiness that defied description. At first, Fusako's breath seemed to climb from somewhere in her chest, but gradually its heat and odor changed until it might have issued from some unfathomable depth within her. Now the fuel firing her breath was different too. They clutched at each other and collided in frenzied, awkward movements, like beasts in a forest lunging at a ring of fire. Fusako's lips softened and became smoother. Ryuji was ready to die happily that very moment. Only when the cool tips of their noses brushed did he realize with a chuckle that they were two firm, separate bodies. He didn't know how much time passed before, pointing toward a slate roof jutting above the cypress trees at the edge of the park. She said, "Why don't you stay with us tonight? That's our house over there." They stood up and looked around. Ryuji jammed his cap on his head and put his arm around Fusako's shoulders. The park was empty. The red and green beacon in the marine tower swept across stone benches in the empty square. The drinking fountain, flower beds, and white stone steps. Out of habit, Ryuji glanced at his watch. He could just see the dial and the light from the street lamp outside the park. A few minutes past 10. Ordinarily, he would have 2 hours until night watch. He couldn't take any more of the noonday heat. The sun was in the west now, frying the back of his head. He had left his cap on the rakuyo. The first mate had given Ryuji a 2-day leave, assigning his watch to the third mate with the understanding that Ryuji would stand in for him at the next port. He had changed clothes on the ship and had with him a sport jacket and tie he planned to wear that evening, but already sweat had bedraggled his dress shirt. He looked at his watch. It was only 4 o'clock. His date with Fusako was for 6. The coffee shop where they had arranged to meet apparently had color television, but there wouldn't be anything interesting on at this hour of the day. Ryuji walked over to the park railing and looked out at the harbor. The warehouse roofs below were extending their 3-cornered shadows toward the foreshore. One white sail was tacking back to the yacht basin. He watched the sun sculpture a brace of tensed muscles in marvelous detail in the snow-white blocks of cloud piled above the offing. They were storm clouds, all right, but not swollen enough for an evening squall. The memory of a mischievous game he had often played as a child drew him across the lawn to the drinking fountain. Closing the mouth of the fountain with his thumb, he squirted a fan of water at the dahlias and white chrysanthemums languishing in the heat. Leaves quivered, A small rainbow arched. Flowers recoiled. Ryuji reversed the pressure of his thumb and doused his hair and face and throat. The water trickled from his throat to his chest and belly, spinning a soft, cooling screen. An indescribable delight. Ryuji shook himself all over like a dog, and carrying his sport jacket over his arm, moved toward the entrance of the park. His shirt was drenched, but he didn't bother to take it off. The sun would dry it quickly enough. Ryuji left the park. He marveled at the serenity of the houses that lined the streets, at the sturdy roofs and rooted, unbudging fences. As always, the details of shore life appeared abstract and unreal. Even when he passed an open kitchen and glimpsed the glitter of polished pots and pans, everything lacked concreteness. His sexual desires, too, the more so because they were physical, he apprehended as pure abstraction. Lusts, which time had relegated to memory, remained only as glistening essences, like salt, crystallized at the surface of a compound. We'll go to bed together again tonight. This one's the last. We probably won't sleep at all. I sail tomorrow evening. I wouldn't be surprised if I evaporated faster than a damn memory, thanks to these 2 fantastic nights. The heat wasn't making him sleepy, but imagination whetted his lust. As he walked along, and he narrowly avoided a large foreign car that came roaring up the hill. Then he saw a group of boys break onto the main road from a footpath near the bottom of the hill. Seeing him, one of them stopped short. It was Noboru. Ryuji noticed the boyish kneecaps below the shorts tighten abruptly, saw tension cramp the face peering up at him. And he recalled what Fusako had said. There was something about Noboru this morning, almost as if he knew. Battling with a part of himself that threatened to be flustered in front of the boy, Ryuji forced a smile and yelled, "Hey, small world, isn't it? Have a good swim?" The boy didn't answer. His clear, dispassionate gaze was fixed on Ryuji's shirt. "Why, how did your shirt get sopped like that?" "What? This?" The artificial smile spread over his face again. "I took a little shower at the fountain up there in the park.